I didn't plan to go back to the office that night. I was already halfway home, stuck in traffic, when I realized I'd left my laptop on my desk. It was around 9:40 p.m. The building should have been empty, but when I walked in, the lights were still on. Not everywhere, just our department. I remember thinking maybe someone was working late. Then I heard it. Laughter. Her laugh. I froze right there in the hallway, because I knew that laugh better than anything in the world, and it wasn't supposed to be here. Not at this hour. Not with someone else. I walked closer. Slow. Quiet. And that's when I heard his voice. My coworker. And then she said something that made my stomach drop. "Don't worry, he has no idea." That's the moment I realized my life wasn't what I thought it was. If you had asked me about my life a year ago, I would have told you that everything was under control. It was not perfect, of course, but it was stable, predictable, and in many ways, exactly what I thought I wanted. I had a steady job, a daily routine that made sense, and a marriage that, at least from the outside, looked strong and reliable. My wife's name is Emily. We met back in college, and from the very beginning, being with her felt natural and easy. There were no games, no confusion, and no emotional chaos. Everything simply worked. She had this way of making even the most ordinary days feel lighter. Even when nothing special was happening, it still felt like enough, just because she was there. We were never the type of couple that tried to impress other people or constantly show off our relationship online. We did not need that kind of attention. Instead, we built a quiet life together. We would have simple dinners at home, spend weekends running errands together, and watch movies late at night, often falling asleep before they even finished. It was not exciting in the way people usually describe happiness, but it felt real and comfortable. And at the time, I truly believed that was more than enough. After 6 years of being together, we decided to get married. The ceremony was small and simple, with only close friends and family present. There was nothing extravagant about it, and that was exactly how we wanted it to be. Everything about our life felt consistent. It was simple. It was predictable. It felt safe. Looking back now, I realized that this sense of safety is exactly what prevented me from seeing what was happening. When your life feels stable, you stop looking for problems. You stop asking questions, and you assume that what you have will always stay the same. Emily worked at a marketing firm downtown. Interestingly, I worked in the same building, just in a different department. At the time, I saw that as something positive. It made us feel connected, even during the workday. Most mornings, we would drive to work together. We would grab coffee in the lobby, talk for a few minutes, and then go our separate ways. Sometimes, when we both stayed late, we would leave the office together as well. It created this feeling that even when we were busy, we were still part of each other's daily lives. At home, things followed a similar pattern. She would usually get home a little earlier than I did and start preparing dinner. When I walked in, I was often greeted by the smell of food and a sense of calm. We would sit down together, talk about our day, share small frustrations about work, and laugh about random things that probably would not seem funny to anyone else. It was a normal life. There was nothing dramatic about it. There was nothing that made me suspicious. If anything, I believed we were doing better than most couples. We did not argue constantly. We did not struggle with jealousy. There were no serious trust issues between us. And in hindsight, that may have been my biggest mistake. I trusted her completely. Not the kind of trust where you still have small doubts hidden in the back of your mind, but absolute trust. I never felt the need to check her phone, question her behavior, or look for signs that something might be wrong. She had access to my phone, and I had access to hers, but neither of us ever used that access in a suspicious way. At least, not as far as I knew. There was simply no reason to believe that anything was being hidden. Sometimes I would even catch myself thinking about how lucky I was. I believed that finding someone you could simply exist with, without constant tension or pressure, was rare. And I thought I had found exactly that. But now I understand something I did not see back then. Peace can be misleading. Sometimes what feels like peace is not actually stability, but silence before something begins to break. And at that time, I had no idea that the life I felt so comfortable in was already starting to change. The signs were there, but they were subtle, and I was not looking for them. If I had paid a little more attention, or questioned even the smallest changes, maybe I would have realized what was happening sooner. Maybe I would not have walked back into that office that night, so completely unprepared for what I was about to hear. But at that point in my life, I still believed everything was exactly as it seemed. I believed my marriage was honest. I believed it was stable. I believed it was real. I had no idea that by then I was already being lied to. Looking back, I cannot point to one exact moment when everything changed. There was no single event, no clear line between what my life used to be and what it was slowly becoming. Instead, the change happened quietly, almost invisibly. At first, it was something so small that I barely noticed it. Emily started staying late at work more often. In the beginning, it made perfect sense. She told me about a new project, tighter deadlines, and additional responsibilities. I did not question it, because it sounded reasonable. In fact, I remember telling her that I was proud of her. I thought she was just working hard. But as time went on, those late nights became more frequent. Then they became normal. Eventually, it reached a point where it felt strange when she came home on time. That was the first shift. Subtle, but real. At the same time, something else began to change. It was not just that she was coming home later. It was how she came home. Emily had always been the kind of person who talked about everything. She would share details about her day, even the small and unimportant ones. But gradually, those conversations started to disappear. When I asked her how her day was, her answers became shorter, more distant. Just work stuff. Long day. Nothing special. At first, I did not think much of it. Everyone has stressful days, and sometimes people just want to be quiet. But this was different. It was consistent. It felt like she was no longer letting me into her world. Like I was only hearing a surface-level version of her life, while everything real was being kept somewhere else. I tried to ignore the feeling. I told myself I was overthinking, that this was normal, that relationships go through phases. But even then, something in the back of my mind started to feel uneasy. Not enough to confront her, but enough to notice. Another thing that changed was her phone. Before, it had never been an issue. She would leave it on the table, on the couch, anywhere. There was nothing secretive about it. But now, it was always with her. If she left the room, the phone went with her. If a message came in, she would glance at it quickly, then turn the screen away. Not in an obvious way. Just enough that it felt intentional. One evening, we were sitting at the dinner table. It was quiet, more quiet than usual. Her phone lit up. I saw the screen for just a second before she turned it over. The movement was quick. Too quick. I remember that moment clearly, because it was the first time something felt undeniably wrong. I tried to keep my voice calm when I asked, "Who was that?" She did not look up immediately. "Just someone from work," she said. There was a brief pause. Then she added, "Mark." She said the name like it meant nothing, like it was just another coworker. And maybe it should have been, except for one thing. In 6 years of being together, I had never heard that name before. Not once. And that stood out to me more than I expected. I did not react. I did not question it further. I simply nodded and let the conversation move on. But internally, something shifted. It was small, but it was there. A quiet awareness. The realization that there was now a part of her life I did not fully understand. Over the next few days, I started noticing that name more often. Not directly, but in small ways. A message that made her smile. A notification she quickly dismissed. Moments where she seemed distracted, like her attention was somewhere else entirely. I never saw anything explicit. Nothing that proved anything. But the pattern was forming. And once you notice a pattern, it becomes impossible to completely ignore it. Still, I chose not to confront it, because the alternative was uncomfortable. Questioning her meant questioning everything, and at that point, I was not ready to do that. It felt easier to trust her, to believe that there was a simple explanation, to convince myself that I was just overthinking normal behavior. But deep down, I knew something was changing. I just did not want to admit how far it might go. And I definitely was not ready for where it would eventually lead me. At some point, it stopped feeling like coincidence. All those small things I had been brushing off as stress or overthinking, they started to connect. And once they did, it became much harder to pretend everything was normal. The name Mark was no longer just a random coworker in my mind. It became something I noticed, something I paid attention to, even when I tried not to. Emily started mentioning him more often, but always in a casual, almost dismissive way. She would say things like, "Mark handled that client today," or "Mark stayed late too." The way she said it made it sound insignificant, but that was exactly what felt strange. It was too controlled, too careful, as if she was trying to normalize his presence in her life without making it seem important. And maybe I would not have questioned it if everything else had not been changing at the same time. She became more protective of her phone. Not dramatically, not in a way that would immediately expose anything, but enough for me to notice. If I walked into the room while she was texting, the screen would tilt away slightly. If a notification appeared, she would clear it faster than before. Again, nothing obvious, but it was consistent. And consistency is what makes small details start to feel real. There were also moments when she seemed somewhere else. We could be sitting together, watching something, and I would notice that she was not really paying attention. Her eyes would be on the screen, but her mind clearly wasn't. Sometimes she would smile at something on her phone, then quickly lock it as soon as I looked in her direction. That smile stayed in my head longer than I expected, because it was not something she shared with me, and that was new. One night, I decided to test something, not in a dramatic way, just a simple observation. We were sitting on the couch, and she had her phone in her hand. I casually said, "Hey, can I see that for a second? I think my phone is dead, and I need to check something." It was not even a serious request, more like an instinct, a way to confirm that everything was still normal. But her reaction was immediate. Too immediate. She hesitated. Just for a second, but it was enough. Then she smiled, a little forced, and said, "Yeah, just give me a moment." She tapped on the screen a few times before handing it to me. That moment stayed with me because it had never happened before. There had never been a "wait a second." There had never been a need to do anything before giving me her phone. And suddenly, there was. I took the phone, but I did not even check anything. At that point, it was not about what was on the screen. It was about the fact that something had changed. Something had shifted between us in a way I could not ignore anymore. Still, I did not confront her. I told myself I needed something real, something undeniable. Because accusations without proof would destroy everything, even if I was wrong. So instead, I started paying closer attention. Not obsessively, but enough to notice patterns. Her schedule, her behavior, the way she spoke. And the more I observed, the clearer it became that there was a part of her life I was no longer included in. A part that existed outside of our routine, outside of our conversations, and somehow connected to him. Mark. I did not know what exactly was going on, but I knew one thing for sure. The version of my marriage I believed in was no longer the full picture. And deep down, even if I did not want to admit it yet, I had already started preparing myself for the possibility that something was very wrong. I just did not realize how close I was to finding out the truth, or how badly it would hit when I finally did. At that point, it was no longer just a feeling. It was no longer something I could dismiss as stress or imagination. The doubt had settled in, and it stayed with me, quietly influencing the way I saw everything. I began to notice details I would have ignored before, not because I wanted to find something, but because it was becoming impossible not to see it. Emily's schedule stopped making sense. There were nights when she told me she would be working late, but something about the timing felt off. She would say she had meetings, yet when I casually mentioned stopping by her office one evening, she immediately discouraged the idea. She smiled when she said it, but the response came too quickly, too naturally, as if she had already thought about that possibility before. "Don't come," she said lightly. "It's boring. You'd just be waiting around." It sounded harmless, but it stayed in my mind longer than it should have. Because before, she would have told me to come anyway. Even if it was boring. Even if we only spent a few minutes together. That small change felt bigger than it looked. Another time, I texted her late in the evening just to check in. She had told me she was still at work. I expected a quick reply, the way she used to respond. But instead, there was nothing. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then almost an hour. When she finally answered, her message was short. "Sorry, busy." No explanation, no follow-up. That was not like her. Emily was never that distant, especially not with me. The gap between what she said and how she acted was starting to grow, and I could feel it. Not as a clear truth yet, but as something heavy in the background. Something I could not ignore anymore. There was also a change in how she looked at me. It was subtle, but it was there. The warmth that used to come so naturally between us felt reduced. Not completely gone, but less present. As if her attention was divided. As if part of her was somewhere else, even when she was sitting right in front of me. One evening, we were having dinner together. The room was quiet. Too quiet. I tried to start a conversation, asking her about her day, hoping for something more than the usual short answers. But once again, her response was minimal. "Same as always," she said. Then she looked down at her phone, and for a brief moment, she smiled. Not at me. At something on that screen. She quickly locked it, but it was too late. I had already seen enough. That moment stayed with me long after the conversation ended, because it confirmed something I had been trying not to fully accept. There was something in her life that made her happy, and it was no longer me. That realization did not come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, until it became impossible to ignore. I still did not have proof. I still did not have anything concrete that I could point to and say, "This is what is happening." But I had enough to know that something was wrong. And more importantly, I had enough to know that I needed to stop pretending everything was fine. That was when my mindset began to change. I stopped simply observing, and I started thinking about what I needed to do next. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but carefully. Because whatever was happening, I knew one thing for certain. If I rushed into it without understanding the full picture, I could lose any chance of knowing the truth. So I decided to wait, to watch, to let things reveal themselves naturally. I told myself that if there was something real going on, It would eventually surface, and I would be there when it did. I just did not expect that moment to come as suddenly as it did, or that it would happen in a place I thought I understood, in a moment that would change everything I believed about my life. Because soon, without planning it, without preparing for it, I was going to walk back into that office at night and finally hear the truth for myself. That night was not supposed to matter in any significant way, and at the time, it felt like nothing more than the end of another long and exhausting workday. I left the office later than usual, feeling mentally drained but relieved that the day was finally over, already thinking about going home, sitting down, and disconnecting from everything that had been building up in my head. I remember driving away from the building, already a few blocks down the road, when a small but important detail suddenly came back to me. I had left my laptop on my desk. For a moment, I considered ignoring it and just dealing with the consequences the next day, because going back felt unnecessary and inconvenient, especially that late at night. But I knew I had work I needed to finish in the morning, and leaving it behind would only make things more complicated. So, after a brief hesitation, I turned the car around. At that moment, it felt like a simple, practical decision. Nothing emotional. Nothing important. Just a small inconvenience that needed to be fixed. But looking back now, I understand that this was the exact moment when everything began to shift in a way I could no longer control. When I pulled into the parking lot, the first thing I noticed was how empty it had become compared to earlier in the day, with only a few scattered cars left under the dim lights. The building itself looked quiet and almost completely dark, which was exactly what I expected at that hour. There was nothing unusual about it, at least not yet. As I walked inside, the silence immediately stood out, because it was so different from the usual noise and movement that filled the space during the day. My footsteps echoed slightly across the floor, and that small detail alone made everything feel more isolated, more distant, almost as if I had stepped into a completely different version of the same place. I made my way toward the elevators, pressing the button and waiting in that quiet stillness, with nothing but my own thoughts to keep me company. When the doors opened and I stepped inside, I was already expecting the next few minutes to be simple and uneventful. Go upstairs, grab the laptop, leave. That was it. No complications, no surprises. But the moment the elevator doors opened onto my floor, something immediately felt off, even before I could fully understand why. The lights were not completely off. A section of the office was still illuminated, casting a soft glow across the otherwise dark space. It was not bright, but it was enough to make it clear that someone was still there. I paused for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing, because at that hour, there was no real reason for anyone to still be working. At least, not in our department. My first instinct was to rationalize it, to tell myself that someone must have stayed late to finish something important, the same way I had done many times before. But then I heard something that made that explanation feel less certain. It was laughter. Soft at first, almost blending into the silence, but clear enough that I could not ignore it. And more importantly, it was familiar. I recognized it immediately. It was her. There was no hesitation in that realization, no uncertainty, because I had heard that laugh too many times in too many different moments to ever confuse it with anyone else. And yet, hearing it there, in that place, at that hour, did not make sense. It felt wrong in a way I could not immediately explain. My body reacted before my mind could fully catch up, as a quiet tension settled in, making it harder to move, harder to think clearly. For a brief moment, I stood still, trying to convince myself that there had to be a normal explanation, something simple that would make everything fall back into place. But even then, somewhere deep down, I already knew that it was not going to be that simple. Slowly, almost without realizing it, I began to walk down the hallway, each step measured and careful, as if moving too quickly might somehow change what I was about to discover. The closer I got, the clearer the voices became, separating from the silence and forming something more defined, something impossible to ignore. And then I heard his voice. Calm, familiar. Mark. In that moment, everything shifted in a way that felt immediate and irreversible, as the doubt I had been holding on to for so long finally gave way to something much more real. I stopped just before turning the corner that would reveal the open office area, standing there in that narrow space between knowing and seeing. Their voices were clear now. Not every word, not every detail, but enough to understand the tone, the closeness, the way they were speaking to each other. It was not professional. It was not distant. It was something personal, something that did not belong in that environment. My heart was beating harder now, not out of panic, but because I could feel the truth forming in front of me, piece by piece, whether I was ready for it or not. And then she said something that made everything stop. Her voice was quiet, almost playful, as if she felt completely comfortable in that moment. Don't worry, he has no idea. There was a short pause, and then they both laughed. That sound stayed in the air longer than it should have, as if time itself had slowed down just enough for me to fully understand what it meant. In that instant, I realized that I did not need to see anything else. I did not need more evidence, more explanations, or more time. That one sentence was enough to connect everything I had been trying to ignore. Every late night, every short answer, every small change that I had convinced myself was nothing. It all came together in that single moment. I stood there, completely still, trying to process how something that had felt so stable, so real, could shift into something unrecognizable without me even noticing when it started. For a few seconds, I did not move, not because I did not know what to do, but because I was trying to accept what I had just heard, trying to understand how my reality had changed without warning. And then, finally, I took a step forward, because at that point, there was no space left for doubt. I needed to see it, with my own eyes. When I finally turned the corner, I already knew that whatever I was about to see would confirm everything I had just heard. But even with that understanding, I was not prepared for how it would actually feel in that moment. They were standing close to each other, near the desks, in that quiet, half-lit office space that suddenly felt completely Chajim to me. Emily was facing him. Mark. Closer than coworkers should ever be. Closer than anything that could still be explained away. For a second, I just stood there, not saying a word, because my mind needed time to catch up with what my eyes were already seeing. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden movement, no attempt to immediately separate. That was what made it worse. They were comfortable. Like this was normal for them. Like this had been happening for a while. Emily noticed me first. Her expression changed instantly, the calmness disappearing from her face and turning into something sharp, something unprepared. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Her voice was not angry. It was not emotional. It was surprised. And that, more than anything, told me that I was not supposed to be there. That I had walked into something I was never meant to see. Mark stepped back slightly, creating a small distance between them, but it felt too late, too forced, like a reaction rather than a truth. I looked at both of them, trying to find something in their faces that would make this feel less real. But there was nothing. No confusion. No denial. Just tension. Heavy and unavoidable. "I forgot my laptop," I said finally, my voice calmer than I expected. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything that did not need to be said out loud. I looked at her again. Really looked this time. as if trying to recognize the person standing in front of me. And in that moment, I realized something that hit harder than anything else. She was not trying to explain. She was not trying to fix it. She was just standing there, caught. "Since when?" I asked quietly. It was a simple question, but it carried everything behind it. She hesitated. Not long. Just enough. And that hesitation was the answer. "It's not what you think," she said. But even as she said it, there was no conviction in her voice. No urgency. It sounded like something automatic. Something people say when there is nothing real left to defend. I let out a short breath, almost like a quiet laugh, but without any humor in it. "Then what is it?" I asked. This time, she did not answer right away, and that silence said more than any explanation could have. Mark looked away, clearly uncomfortable now, as if he suddenly realized he should not be part of this moment. But for me, he was no longer the focus. It was her. It had always been her. Everything I thought we had, everything I believed in, was standing right in front of me, and it no longer looked the same. "I heard you," I said. Her eyes shifted slightly. "Out there, in the hallway." That was the moment when whatever was left between us finally broke, because she understood that there was nothing left to hide. No version of the story that could change what had already happened. No explanation that could undo what I had seen and heard. And in that moment, I realized that the truth is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, simple, and impossible to ignore. For a few seconds after I said that, no one moved. It was as if everything had finally reached a point where there was nothing left to hide, but also nothing left to say that could fix it. Emily looked at me, and for the first time that night, I saw something different in her expression. Not just surprise, not just tension, something heavier, something closer to realization. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she said quietly. That sentence stayed in the air between us, and for a moment, I just looked at her, trying to understand how that was the first thing she chose to say. Not an apology, not an explanation, just that. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to her. "Then how?" I asked. "How was I supposed to find out?" She did not answer right away, and again, that silence said more than anything else, because the truth was obvious. I was not supposed to find out. At least, not yet. Maybe not ever. Mark shifted slightly beside her, clearly uncomfortable, as if he wanted to disappear from the situation completely. And honestly, at that point, he barely mattered to me. He was part of it, yes. But he was not the one who broke what we had. I looked back at Emily, and something inside me felt different, not explosive, not emotional in the way I expected. Just clear, like everything had finally settled into place. "Was any of it real?" I asked. This time my voice was quieter, but heavier, because that question was not about what I had just seen. It was about everything before it. All the years, all the moments, all the trust. She looked down for a second, then back at me. "Yes," she said. And I believed that she believed it, but it did not change anything. Because whatever had been real before was no longer enough to explain what was happening now. I took a step back, creating distance between us, not because I needed space physically, but because something had already shifted emotionally. "I'm not going to do this here," I said calmly. There was no point in arguing in that empty office. No point in raising my voice or trying to force answers that would not fix anything. This was already over. Maybe it had been over for longer than I realized. "I'll be home later," she said, almost instinctively, as if trying to hold on to some version of normal. I looked at her for a moment. Then I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. And that was it. No long explanation. no dramatic ending. Just a simple answer that carried everything behind it. I walked past them, straight to my desk, picked up my laptop, and for a brief second, I stopped. Not because I was unsure, but because I was recognizing that this was the last moment of my life as I knew it. Everything after this would be different. When I walked out of that office, the silence followed me again. But this time, it felt different. Before, it was calm. Now, it was empty. Not peaceful. Just empty. I got into my car and sat there for a while without starting the engine, staring straight ahead, trying to process everything that had just happened. But the truth was already clear. There was nothing left to figure out. No confusion. No doubt. Just a reality I could not ignore anymore. And in that moment, I understood something I wish I had realized earlier. Sometimes, the hardest part is not discovering the truth. It is accepting that once you know it, there is no going back to who you were before.